whatever kind of chicken little sky is falling people think that activists are doing right now, they couldn't be more wrong. There is a concerted, strategic effort on the part of an anti-democratic few to use the processes of democracy to get in office, and once they're in office, to pull the levers to make it nearly impossible for them to be taken out of office, whether in the midst of their service or during an election season. And that's what we need to pay attention to as folks who just at least respect the power and the right of one person, one vote.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining me for this episode of Hate Comes to Main Street. If you like what we're doing here, be sure to hit like, subscribe, and share. Today's guest is someone I really needed to hear from. When you're doing this sort of work, confronting hate, it's easy to become demoralized, to become discouraged, and to feel overwhelmed. He is someone who diagnoses the problems that he sees with white Christian nationalism, but he also offers hope. He is Dr. Jemar Tisby. He is a historian by training and the author of 3 books, The Color of Compromise, How to Fight Racism, and The Spirit of Justice. Let me start with the title of my website. My podcast is Hate Comes to Main Street. I hear a lot of times from people saying, well, Christian nationalism, there are people who love God, there are people who love their country. This isn't about hate. From your perspective, does the conversation about Christian nationalism belong under the heading of hate?
It absolutely does. And for people to say it doesn't is a wild claim. I think what happens a lot of times is people, probably of a conservative bent, I wouldn't even call them far right, but they read the headlines, they hear maybe the top line about white Christian nationalism, and it looks a lot like a world they're familiar with, and they automatically say, well, it's not that bad. We're not about hate. We love God. We love country. I don't see what's the big deal. Well, you got to go beyond the headline. You got to go beyond the tagline and do a little bit of research. I really hope that in this particular moment, people take their civic responsibility very seriously, and the foundation of civic responsibility is to become informed. So this thing, white Christian nationalism, is a phrase that's been tossed around, and it has a lot to do with democracy and where our democracy is or isn't today. And so dig a little deeper and you'll find a couple of things. Number one, this is not just some left or liberal woke phrase that people who hate America use. That's not it at all. It's actually an academic field. It falls under the field of religious extremism and religious nationalism, and a particular subfield of Christian nationalism as expressed in the United States. So I say all that because there are data scientists behind this, there are historians behind this, there's an increasing number of theologians who are looking into this. And when you do that research, you quickly discover that this is not simply about an innocuous love for God and country. It's actually a pernicious authoritarian movement that wants to create a social hierarchy that includes race, gender, class, and is anti-democratic to its core.
And when people say, well, the term itself, Christian nationalism, is just a liberal term for Christians who love their country. I mean, the fact is, the people who are steeped in this world, they use the term Christian nationalism. You have Stephen Wolfe, who wrote the treatise on the case for Christian nationalism. So this is not something we are making up.
It's not, and that's an interesting example that you bring up, because I think it illustrates how certain people will co-opt terms and make them mean something different. As I said a moment ago, Christian nationalism is an actual academic field of study with a body of work and research behind it. What folks on the far right tend to do is to take these terms that have actual meaning and definition, extract that meaning and definition, and then put something else in its place. So with Christian nationalism, they will rebrand it to say, oh, it's positive. It's just about loving your country and being a Christian. And everybody who says Christian nationalism is bad, they hate America and they don't love God. That is an absolute co opting of the term. Another example is with the term woke. WOKE. That is a movement term that Black activists have used for decades and decades, but it became repopularized in the mid 2010s among the Black Lives Matter movement. And all it really means is to be socially conscious, to be aware of injustice, and to want to do something positive about it. But it's been co opted to mean something negative and harmful and not helpful in the struggle for justice. So we got to be very careful when people start to adopt these terms, but then completely rewrite their definition.
Well, let me ask you about the terminology because I struggle with this, and I'll admit that. Christian nationalism versus white Christian nationalism. And I struggle with it because there are, studies showing that Black Americans, for example, a fairly significant percentage would qualify as Christian nationalists. And not every Christian nationalist I encountered is have encountered is focused so much on race. Where do you come down on this terminology of Christian nationalism versus white Christian nationalism?
I always say the white part out loud because that's the part that becomes easy for people to skip over. And yet it is integral to the project of nationalism in general. So a moment ago, I mentioned a a hierarchy. That's essentially, think of it this way. If folks who ascribe to white Christian nationalist ideology have their dream of the nation completely fulfilled, what does it look like? Is it very racially and ethnically diverse, particularly at the top? No. If there's a hierarchy, who's at the top of that pyramid? It's going to be white wealthy men. And that's actually what we're seeing right now. And people will say, oh, no, no, no. Well, we have people of color in this position, in that position. Well, let me tell you one thing. Number one, there's no ideological diversity allowed here, right? Like you have to toe the party line. The moment you step out of line, you're out. And that is much more contingent and much more precarious for any person of color, also for women. So the racial and the gender aspect are tied together. And in a sort of perfect white Christian nationalist world, God forbid, you would have this ranking of peoples. And to your point, where, well, there are Black people, other people of color who subscribe to this ideology, there's two ways to think about that. So, number one is true, but a lot of times, like I said, the folks who are people of color, Black people who subscribe to the ideology, your acceptance in those circles is wildly contingent on your absolute fealty to the ideology and the people above you. And there are always people above you when you are Black or a person of color in white Christian nationalist worlds. The other part is there are Black people who on paper and who according to, the data and the polling would actually check a lot of the same boxes of belief that white Christian nationalists do, but when it comes to political behavior, behave diametrically differently. And my example of this is when you look at all of the polling, the two Christian groups that are furthest apart are white evangelicals and Black Protestants. They vote almost completely different from one another. And yet Both of these groups would claim to have a high view of scripture. They would be frequent church attenders. They would say they love God. They would say they love their country. But then when it comes to political behaviors, they are absolutely the opposite.
That's right. And I think the studies have shown that Black Americans, for example, who sort of fit this notion of Christian nationalist ideology, they're not inclined to impose their views on the rest of the country, as opposed to the white Christian nationalists who are all about that. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely correct. When you look at, so my research, I'm a historian, and my research is sort of ping pongs back and forth between the Black Christian tradition and white Christian nationalism, and in a sense, they're two sides of a coin. And when you compare the political theologies of the Black Christian tradition and white Christian nationalism, they are so different. And you don't have to be a researcher and dig into all the history. All you got to do is look at the fruit, look at the results of their political behavior. So when you look at the Black Christian tradition and political activism, what tends to happen? It's an expansion of voting rights, an expansion of civil rights, moving closer toward a multiracial participatory democracy. When you look at the political behavior of white Christian nationalists, it's the exact opposite. It is a narrowing of voting rights. It becomes harder to participate as an average citizen, is a more concentrated power among the few, tending toward authoritarian, anti-democratic expressions. And so you can just look at the results of the way of these political behaviors to get a sense of how different they are.
There will be some people who say, yes, you have these white Christian nationalists out there, but they're in a minority. Why worry about them? Why give them attention? Just ignore them and they'll go away. What's your answer to that?
If it could be true, that would be lovely. If we could just ignore them, stop talking about them, and they would go away like a bee that you don't want to sting you. Just ignore it and move on, and maybe it'll find somewhere. But that's not how it works. So let's talk about the numbers. I am a senior democracy fellow with the Public Religion Research Institute. They do multiple surveys every year with massive samples of tens of thousands of people in certain studies. And what they found is it is true that the most passionate, ardent adherents to white Christian nationalism are a minority, only around 10% of the population. Those are in a category we would call Christian nationalism adherents. But then there's this other category of people called Christian nationalist sympathizers who largely believe the same things, just don't hold as tightly or aren't as certain about it. And they're about 20% of the population. And so you combine those together, it's about 30%, which is still a minority. But here's the kicker: they all tend to vote the same. They all tend to be a block politically that is Republican and right leaning. And so when it comes to voting, whether that's at the local, state, or national level, they are very powerful because they are in lockstep around policies, around politicians, around voting and election behaviors. So they sort of punch above their weight demographically. Even though they're a minority, they still essentially have a monopoly on one of the two major political parties in our country.
And they recognize that they are in a minority, but they're focused on using democratic processes to gain control and to essentially do away with democracy, correct?
I mean, you're seeing it in real time in Tennessee. The pressing thing right now, I'm in some of the Black activist circles with lawyers and organizers and whatnot. It the it is an absolute five-alarm fire for democracy. What is happening now is all designed to tip the scales in the favor of a far right contingent come midterms. And what's happening with the voting rights stuff is they are scrambling, mostly in the southern states, the states of the former Confederacy, to redraw districts that will essentially dilute Black political power. And so we saw this where they redrew the district, including Memphis, and stand to lose a representative there. The same thing has been done in Louisiana, in Alabama, in other states. Mississippi's now considering it. And so it is beyond urgent. And whatever kind of chicken little sky is falling people think that activists are doing right now, they couldn't be more wrong. There is a concerted, strategic effort on the part of an anti democratic few to use the processes of democracy to get in office, and once they're in office, to pull the levers to make it nearly impossible for them to be taken out of office, whether in the midst of their service or during an election season. And that's what we need to pay attention to as folks who just at least respect the power and the right of one person, one vote.
I've done some reporting recently about the Southern Baptist Convention, and you have this contention associated with the Center for Baptist Leadership that is very pro-Christian nationalist, and they're trying to push the Southern Baptist Convention further to the right. What is the threat that Christian nationalism poses to the church itself?
I have said for years that white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. Both of those aspects are critical. So we talked a moment ago about the threat to democracy. They're redrawing districts. They are trying to get voter rolls. They are purging voter rolls, all of those things. So it's a threat to democracy, but it's also a threat to the witness of the church. So there's a few things happening here. Number one, what's going on with the SBC and other similar denominations. I used to be part of the Presbyterian Church in America, which is a Southern Presbyterian roots, and so very similar in history to the SBC. It's happening there too. What's going on is first a hardening of stances around hierarchy and ideology. So the Southern Baptist Convention, as we speak today, has just concluded its annual meeting. They voted to approve an amendment that says women were not permitted in the office or the function of pastor, elder, or overseer, essentially confining the office of pastor to men. But that has been the denomination's stance forever, basically. So you don't need the rule. So what's happening? They are further clarifying the language and expanding the coverage to make sure that no church in the SBC ordains women and can remain in the SBC. So that's the hardening I'm talking about. But along with that, they just elected a far right candidate for their denomination president, Willie Rice, who has said that the denomination has been too influenced by social justice warriors, by woke, by the liberal left, and it needs to be pulled back from the brink. Otherwise, it's going to go the way of, I think he used the term blockbuster video, out of business, irrelevant. So there's a hardening. The other aspect here is that these white Christian nationalist forces, they're driving more moderate people out, and they are co-opting the entire mechanisms of these denominations. So SBC is the largest Protestant denomination in the country. It's about 12 million members or so. It doesn't have to be a majority of the 12 million. It just has to be a few people in key positions at seminaries, at the denominational level, to actually careen the denomination in a much harder far right direction. And that is really chilling when you think of the size and the influence of something like the SBC.
Yeah, I should note that they say, well, we're just being true to what Scripture says. Your response to that?
They will always claim a biblical foundation for what they are doing. As a historian, I look back at the church and race, and the Bible was used to justify racism. The Bible was used to justify race-based chattel slavery. The Genesis chapter 9 and the so-called curse of Ham was used to say that people of African descent were condemned by God to a lifetime, generations of servitude, right? People were
There are still people saying that today.
That is wild to me. That is terrible hermeneutics. Like, I went to seminary for 5 years and, you know, a professor should laugh you out of the classroom if you try to use a passage like that to justify race-based chattel slavery. And they did the same thing with segregation. So in the 1950s, the president of Belhaven College, now university, was a guy named G.T. Gillespie. And he was speaking to a group of Presbyterian elders, and he used a passage from Leviticus that said you shouldn't mix wool and cotton or diverse fabrics to argue that you shouldn't mix races and argue for segregation. So when folks say, oh, we're just being biblical, you can twist the Bible to say whatever you want. But here's how we have to look at it. The Bible also says, look at the fruit. What is the fruit of these policies? What we're seeing with the SBC and their stance toward women is women leaving the church in droves. We are seeing one of the most pernicious results of patriarchy, which is the sexual abuse scandals that have rocked the denomination. We're seeing a closing of ranks behind powerful men to protect them. And we are seeing the silencing or the denigrating of women who have the courage to come forward and say what happened to them and tell the truth. So that's the fruit of this theology. And we don't even have to talk about the racial aspect, but you get the point. So just saying, oh, this is biblical, you got to understand the hermeneutic and the theology. And you don't even have to be a scholar or a theologian to look at the results of what they say is them being biblical. And if it doesn't look anything like Jesus, then you got to question that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I recently interviewed a Christian nationalist candidate for governor here in Tennessee. And over again, he kept saying, well, God's word is clear on X point, and this point and that point. And I said, well, if God's word is as clear as you say it is, why do we have so many denominations? And, and for me, I have, when it comes to my faith, I have far too much humility to know exactly
Mm,
what is the one true interpretation
mm.
of the Bible. And yet it seems like those who are most dogmatic, who most want to exert political control, there is no gray area. It's black and white, and they are just not willing to entertain that they may be wrong in the interpretation of God's word.
I was talking to a Jewish friend of mine who works in an industry where he was around a lot of white evangelical Christians. And it was so interesting to hear his assessment of them. And he put it so poignantly in just a single sentence. And he said, they're the people who don't have any questions. And that stuck with me because what he's saying is they're the folks who feel like they've got it all figured out. That whatever questions there were about the Bible, about God, even about politics and society, all those questions have been answered. And all you have to do to be a quote unquote good Christian is just follow the rule book, follow all the answers that they have come up with. And they've inoculated themselves against other interpretations, other ways of answering those questions. And by way of example, I think one of the things that we have to look at is the near illiteracy of a lot of white Christians when it comes to the Black Christian tradition. It's as if Black Christianity in the United States doesn't even exist, or to the extent that it does, it's subordinate. It's not as good as the religion they've come up with. It's good for entertainment. We'll listen to them sing, or we like how animated they get when they preach. But when it actually comes to their theology, like a political theology, how does this work itself out and express itself? How do you have a Raphael Warnock, who's a literal pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, where MLK was the pastor, who's also a U.S. senator? How does his political expression of Christianity differ from the candidate that you just mentioned? And is it as legitimate in their mind? So the people who don't have any questions are the people who don't have any humility to listen and to say there might be other ways of responding to these real big questions about politics, identity, ethics than we've been taught.
Yeah, and if you have not seen this, we may see your head explode on camera here, but there's even one of these Christian nationalist pastors, Joel Webbon, who has said that Black Americans should be seeking out white churches because there are not enough properly trained Black pastors to be able to meet their spiritual needs.
I saw that. My head did explode at the time. I'm still putting the pieces back together. It is an outrageously, obviously racist, but also we gotta insert the term paternalistic view as well. So this is one of the expressions of, you could say, white supremacy or racism is paternalism. So here's a historical example. On the plantation in the antebellum period, right? The plantation was considered an extended household. So you had the actual household of the white male enslaver, and he was the patriarch over it all. He was at the very top. His white wife was subordinate to him. His white children were subordinate to them, but they were the sort of nucleus. And I specify white wife and white children because he was often sexually abusing enslaved Black women. And so he had uh, children by these assaults, and they were considered part of the household too, but not on the level of the white household, right? So he would also consider the broader enslaved people on his plantation as his household. But here's the thing. You think, oh, household, family members, love, support, all those things that should be true of family. That's not how it worked. What that meant in a plantation society was a paternalistic view of Black people as perpetual children. And like children, they need to be guided, disciplined, corrected, taught. And who had all the answers? The white male enslaver was in charge of their spiritual, physical, economic well being. That same sort of mentality and mindset can be heard and in echoes of what Joel Webbon said. He said they're not properly trained, meaning they haven't gone to the seminaries or institutions that I, as a white Christian, approve of. They don't express the faith that I, as a white Christian, approve of. And so there's this paternalistic bent where Black people, we can't educate ourselves. We can't read the Bible for ourselves. We need the loving, benevolent guidance of some other person, typically a white man, to guide us into proper understanding. And so there's that paternalism right there as a through line, past and present.
Lest anyone watching this comes away completely depressed, let's give viewers some action points. What can Americans, what can Christians do in response to this threat that you're describing?
Well, first of all, let's talk about this idea of hope. Most of us kind of categorize hope as a feeling. I think it's more accurate to say hope is action. So, my latest book is called The Spirit of Justice: True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. We got to remember there were times in our history when Black people, in particular, didn't have any real external signs of hope. You think the Civil War came around in the 1860s. Well, how would an enslaved Black person in the 1830s or the 1790s have viewed their circumstances? They wouldn't have seen on the horizon any sort of conflagration like the Civil War. It would have looked like, well, this is my entire life. And yet, they were somehow able to come up with music and dance and have families and laugh and find joy in the world. Everything they did to push back against their own dehumanization was an act of hope. Similar to today, everything we do to push back against the dehumanization of ourselves or our neighbors, to push back against anti democratic forces, is a sign of hope. So we shouldn't just be looking for hope as this buoyant feeling. We should be looking for hope as the actions that we take to resist oppression. Then you get to, well, what actions do we take to resist oppression, especially right now? That's where I go to my second book, How to Fight Racism. It's structured around this framework I call the Arc of Racial Justice. And that's an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. Awareness, relationships, commitment. And like the three legs of a stool, you need all three to have a solid base. Awareness. This is one thing you can do is listen to a podcast like this. Inform yourself. So when people say white Christian nationalism, that just means you love your country. You can say, oh, no, no, no. It's actually an academic field under religious extremism and religious nationalism. And here's what the data say. It's listening to panels, watching documentaries, the podcast, reading your Substack, those kinds of things to build your awareness. But you don't just stop there. You also need relationships. Relationships can be one to one or with groups. And so, how can we form coalitions of people, which could be as small as a book study or your faith community? It could be as large as being part of a national organization pushing for democratic reforms. How can you walk together with other people, particularly across historic lines of division, like with race or class or gender? And then lastly is commitment, not just staying the course, being faithful in the struggle, but a commitment to dismantling injustice on a systemic and institutional level. And so that means, how can we affect more than one person at once? What laws or policies need to change? And that's not just political. Your church has policies. Your place of work and employment has policies. Your school has policies. How can we work on that level to see change? And the last thing I'll say is, where do you start? You start local. When we look at Washington, D.C., when we look at the White House, when we look at the national news, it is overwhelming. No single person can alter the course of all of these huge events. What happens is you have local movements that build the infrastructure, build the relationships, raise the awareness, work towards systemic change. And those are the movements that catch on and then have ripple effects across the country. And so, where do you start? You look right around you, and it doesn't have to be the same issue for everyone. Maybe you're passionate about voting rights. Maybe you're passionate about women's equality. Maybe you're passionate about protecting the climate and the environment. Wherever you feel that passion, say, where can I get started right where I am? And then how can I bring others along with me? And that's all we're called to do.
Well, I could have this conversation for an hour, but we'll save that for another day. Where can people find you?
Well, like you, I am on Substack at jamartisby.substack.com. We just got the word yesterday that we moved from the number 5 ranked podcast in the history category up to number 4. And so we are the
Congratulations.
number 4 ranked Substack in the history category, over 50,000 subscribers. You can join for free or become a paid subscriber at jamartisby.substack.com.
And you have a conversation weekly, I think, called The Convocation that I really enjoy. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for taking time for this conversation.
Glad to do it. Hope to be back anytime.